Naš sagovornik je legendarni izvještač BBC-a iz opkoljenog Sarajeva, bivši zastupnik u Donjem domu Britanskog parlamenta, čovjek čije su reportaže sa ratišta iz Hrvatske i Bosne i Hercegovine korištene kao dokazni materijal u Hagu, gdje je više puta i svjedočio. Ranjen je snajperskim hicem u Sarajevu tokom agresije na Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Dobar dan, poželjet ću gospodinu Martinu Bellu. Mr. Bell, welcome.
My pleasure.
Mr. Bell, 18 to 20 years ago, you reported from Bosnia and Herzegovina about the war in our country. Today, you're talking about peace. You are in, so to speak, in a peacekeeping mission.
I always wanted to be a peace correspondent, but fate turned out otherwise. And of all my 18 war zones, the one that affected me most was this one. And the country I love the most beside my own is this one, and therefore it is a pleasure to be back.
You are a witness of history and some of the really worst crimes. Why is it important to remember the mass crimes and today to teach about them?
I think it is important to remember all the mass crimes, not just the worst, but all the others as well. And when I give my speeches when I was in Parliament and talking about this great country, one of the points I would make was there was no monopoly of evil and no monopoly of suffering. But terrible things happened, and numerically the worst of all was Srebrenica. And I think the peoples of Europe have to learn that this kind of thing can happen because of the hatred we can have in our own hearts. And until the hatred is gone and we find other ways of settling our differences, there was always the risk that what happened here can happen somewhere else.
At a time when you reported about the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you were not in Srebrenica because access to the Serbian territory was denied. To what extent the recording of execution of men committed by the Scorpions was contributed to change or to changing the consciousness of the world about what happened in Srebrenica?
Unfortunately, we were denied access to Republika Srpska from August 1994. So when it came to 95 and all those people disappeared, we could only guess. But you can't base a television report on guesswork, and therefore it was slow to come out. We suspected the worst when we saw the satellite photographs of the earth moving in and around Srebrenica. And then, of course, slowly the truth came out. And those who wished to deny it, denied it, up until the time when the damning video was produced, which you referred to by the Scorpions, which is absolutely unwatchable. It's so horrible. It's a systematic, hellish roadside execution. But it was introduced as evidence in the tribunal in The Hague. And from that point on, all realistic denial went away, though it is still attempted. You know, the evidence is there.
What was the role of foreign media during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Which are Bosnian politicians you have cooperated with? Maybe you talk about some of them in your book. With whom of them have you actively cooperated, and what can you say about their role during the war from this distance now, 20 years ago?
From this distance now, I think the foreign media seems more important than it did at the time. At the time, I was putting into the public domain these terrible images all over of suffering people, suffering peoples, and my country, my government. The people cared, but the government seemed not to. And to the shame of the international community, we took token actions like escorting food convoys, like declaring the safe areas, like setting up the international court. But I said all along, and I wrote at the time, we could have ended it sooner. The politicians, I liked them, actually. Obviously, we spent a lot of time with Haris Silajdžić on this side. On the other side, I saw Radovan Karadzic very regularly. He was personally helpful. And so was his deputy, Nikola Koljevic, who tragically shot himself at the time of the Dayton Agreement. So it's not as if we courted the politicians only on one side. We needed them for access. I even got on with the notorious Arkan, the leading paramilitary, because he gave you access to things, and he too met a bad end. But if you only, as a journalist, especially in time of war, if you only talk to people you like, you're not going to get very far.
You met Mladic and Karadzic during the war. What is your experience and what can you say about this experience?
I met Mladic not often. I did on one occasion try to prevent him strangling in front of in the airport. Kurt Schork, the Reuters correspondent, and Nikola Kolevic he appealed to me to calm my friend down. I said, I'll calm down my friend if you'll calm down yours. Karadzic we saw a lot up until we were excluded. And then I never saw him again until, I mean, he called me, he wrote a tract to call to my defense in which he called John Burns of the New York Times, Christian Amanpour of CNN and myself, he called us media monstrosities. Then when I gave evidence in his case 2 years ago, he asked to see me in his guarded cell, and I did, and he could not have been more affable. And in open court he called me a precious witness. So, you know, I got to know these people fairly well. One of the advantages from a journalistic point of view is that it was so difficult to get here and so dangerous to live here that there were not that many of us here, even especially at the height of the war. So you weren't dealing with spin doctors and press officers. You were dealing with the main players, with Karadzic, with Selajic, with Izetbegovic, with Tihomir Blaskic, the Croat general in central Bosnia, and of course with all the United Nations commanders.
There were rather often efforts to impose the thesis that it was a civil war rather than the aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina. How is your comment, or how would you comment this?
Arkan and his Tigers ethnically cleansed Zvornik in early April 1992. The beginning of the end of the war was the attack by main force Croatian units in 1995. I mean, in the realistic world, I don't think foreign powers were going to stay out. I think the tragedy was that the foreign powers who intervened were the local ones, Serbia, Croatia, and the foreign powers who held up their hands and said it's none of our business were the Western democracies. And I think the blame for this terrible war rests not only with those who did and directed the fighting, but also with those governments like my government, which allowed it to happen.
What do you think about the role of the international community during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
I think the role of the international community initially was shameful. There was no international community when it broke out, except of course the headquarters of UNPROFOR. But after they were blitzed out, they beat a hasty retreat, and there was no one left but the international press. And then the United Nations and the European community then embarked on a series of token interventions, like the declaration of the safe areas, when negotiation failed, and then the fighting just intensified. And looking back at it historically, I think that what made the difference tragically, it could have been ended so quickly.
You have reported actually from 18 battlefields. Can you compare your experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina with the other war zones you have been?
I think for all of us, this war affected us more than, I started in Vietnam, for heaven's sake. This war affected us more than any other we'd ever been in. Partly because we were so close to the suffering of so many people. Partly because we love the country and its people, all its peoples. I had some very good friends in Republika Srpska, and I hope I still do. And we were marked by it. We took quite a lot of casualties. I lost a very dear friend of mine, a Croatian cameraman blown away near Jajce on All Souls Day 1993. So I wasn't here, but last year on the 20th anniversary, there was a great ingathering, 100 or 200 of the journalists who were here. They wouldn't have done that for any other country in the world. We all feel, and I'm sure I speak for all of us, that this is a very special place with very special people.
Mr. Bell, it was a really great pleasure to meet you and to speak to you. Thank you so much, and thank you for being in Bosnia again.
Thank you.